This is Jeffrey Arend as we recall the greatest aviation historian, Ronald Edward George R.E.G. Davies, curator of air transport at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, who died Saturday, July 30th, 2011 in Shaftesbury, England, at 90 years old. Ron's legacy to aviation is captured in 25 books and other social efforts and are as pioneering and important in scope as many of the subjects he wrote about, including Lindbergh, Earhart, the Berlin airlift, and almost every major airline in the world, past and present. Although we were friends and colleagues and even tackled a few projects together during our 3 decades, the last talking session we had was inside Ron's apartment in McLean, Virginia, in 2010. For no particular reason other than my need to capture moments in both words and pictures, I had brought along a small digital camera. I recorded the entire 90-minute conversation, never knowing that this scrap of footage would be the last ever taken of my dear friend. Here in part 2, Ron opens up about why in the last chapter of a life in aviation, the viability and importance of developing global rail services had come into such clear focus to him. No doubt the potential of rail was much on Ron's mind, as he actually delivered a couple of speeches and wrote an in-depth article on the subject presented here in today's Flying Typers and available to everyone to read at www.aircargonews.com. We can only imagine that eventually, to make his case about rail, there would have been a book with Ron's signature hand-drawn maps and, of course, his penchant for exacting detail, indexing, and guides to further reading. Here, from his last video interview in 2010, Riding the Rails, is Ron Davies. Tell me, sir, after, 30 years at the National Air and Space Museum, studying the aviation arts, how do you come to have such a high opinion of rail in 2010?
Well, because back in 1964, when I was doing market research for the de Havilland Company in Britain, and I was researching then the market, the potential market for the Trident airplane. I went to Japan and did a survey, and to my astonishment found that on the intercity route between Tokyo and Osaka, there were trains about every 10 minutes or so. And that was the only way they could cope with the massive traffic demand. And although there was airline services, sort of shuttle service, but the airlines were only carrying, I don't think, more than about 5% of the total traffic. And I was there in a subsequent visit when they opened the high-speed rail, the Shinkansen bullet trains. Yeah. And I traveled on one of the early, within a few weeks of it opening, and I went to Osaka on that train, and I couldn't believe it. It took me about several months when I got back to Britain and did my reports and mentioned the fact that these trains were going to be the thing of the future. I suddenly realized that high-speed rail was not just an improved train, it was a new form of transport. Yeah. It was so much ahead of ordinary express trains. It was rather like comparing the introduction of trains back in the 19th century, comparing them with stagecoaches. It was a completely different form of transport.
So yeah, so now we're in 2010, and you're looking at high-speed rail again. And tell me what you think its future is, both here in America and other places in the world, but specifically, I guess, here in America.
I'll start with other places in the world. Yeah. Gradually, following Japan in 1964, think how long ago that is now. In 1981, Europe joined high-speed rail with the Train à Grande Vitesse, the TGVs of France, and Europe started high-speed rail, and then came, I think the next one was Korea, and so on. There are now today 30 countries in the world. In fact, only 2 or 3 weeks ago I read that Thailand is going to join the club. 30 countries in the world which are either operating or building or in the advanced stage of planning high-speed rail, which has to be completely new. It's no good trying to convert existing tracks. You've got to build a brand new track, because the Japanese realized that the secret of high speed doesn't lie in the locomotives. It lies in the track. It's got to be dead straight, or as near straight as you can get it, or and dead level. The minute when the Japanese introduced the Shinkansen, the minimum radius of a curve was 4 kilometers. If the curvature was less than a 4-kilometer radius, the trains had to reduce speed.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was a mountain in the way, you bored through it. Just an example of that is the Italians. It's taken them a long time. They got there last year from Rome early this year from Rome to Milan. Before they could do that, they had to do a straight and level stretch through the Apennine Mountains between Florence and Bologna. Mm-hmm. There are 79 kilometers of track, and 72 kilometers are through tunnels.
Wow.
That's what you've got to do. And so you've got all the countries of Western Europe pretty well now have high-speed rail. In Eastern Asia, you've got Japan, Korea, and Taiwan.
Yes.
And only 2 years ago, the Chinese got into the act. Early this year, the Chinese opened the world's fastest high-speed train between Wuhan in the center of China and Guangzhou, 600 miles, 3 hours. The average speed is 200 miles an hour. They have China now has the fastest trains. And you mentioned the United States. Forget it. There's no such thing as high-speed rail. And although President Obama announced a program, he's talking about really improved express trains. I mean, people here think Amtrak is high speed. The Acela, the average speed between Washington and New York on Acela is 88 miles an hour. Well, God, we were doing that in Britain about 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's really the big problem here is the influence of the oil industry. It's what I call the road lobby. It's the oil industry and the car manufacturing, Detroit, and the people who build the high-speed interstate highways. Once you've got contracts to build roads here, you're made for life, because roads are constantly wearing out.
Sure. And
cars keep wearing out, and cars can't run except with oil. Now trains can run. You can extract the electricity from many sources.
What do you see as the future, sir? Not to interrupt you, sir.
Well, getting back to the last chapter of my new book, I'm dealing with high-speed rail, because for almost any distance in an industrial country, up to about 500 miles, high-speed rail can provide better intercity distance in between the centers of cities, not on the airports, which are on the edge of cities. They provide better times and better fares and better everything than air. And in fact, in Europe now, there are 2 or 3 routes in Europe, short-haul routes, where you cannot fly. There's no air service between Paris and Brussels. There's no air service between Frankfurt and Cologne. And I don't think between Paris and Lyon. And simply because it's not worth it.
So do you think the cargo business will also benefit from the high-speed rail?
No, in a complete contrast to the appalling situation of passenger rail in the United States, the USA has an absolutely superb rail cargo service.
Yes.
The cargo trains I saw one in Arizona last year, and by chance I happened to be speaking to somebody about air, but I said, oh, by the way, you live in Phoenix, I think it was. I said, what do you do for a living? Oh, he said, I drive, I'm a driver on, engineer on the railroads. I said,
Yeah.
what, those big trains, those big freight trains? Oh, yes, he said. I said, yeah, I do the regular route between here and Dallas, I think it was, or El Paso or somewhere. I said, well, as a matter of interest, is it true that the trains are more than a mile long? He said, oh yes, he said, I'm just resting up from the one I brought in. I think it was a mile and a half long or something like that. It's absolutely enormous. And the load that they carry is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
But you know, those freight trains beat up the track, so you can't run a high speed. You can't even the track, the Amtrak track between here and New York is an exclusive track, not the same track as
Right.
they have the other trains on.
Yeah. Well, we often see advertisements of freight moving parallel to the highway as a better way to move heavy goods. So apparently in America, that's one area where we've excelled and gotten it right.
Absolutely. And all over, I take 2 railroad magazines, and they have special issues on freight in Europe now, and they're gradually, and as you see, the railroads now, all over the world, except here, they're not only talking and planning and building high-speed rail, they're also improving all the other railroads as well.
Yes.
And only last week, in the latest issue of the International Railroad Journal, there's a map of all the railroads that they're building in Saudi Arabia. They're crossing, not only they're crossing the desert from Riyadh and Dammam to Mecca and Jeddah, dead straight across the. They're also building. They're building a high-speed line from Medina to Mecca and Riyadh. Jeddah. They're extending the line north of there to that old line that the same route that Lawrence of Arabia blew up, and they're also going to build a line from Riyadh on the Gulf northwesterly to the northwest of Saudi Arabia. They're going to cover all except the empty desert of southern Arabia. They're going to cover the Saudi Arabia with railroads, and all over the world they're doing this. The Chinese will have more high-speed rail in 2012 than all the rest of the world put together.
Wow.
And including Beijing to Shanghai, which they've got 100,000 workers working on building that line right now. You know, the Chinese are able to do it. You know, if the head of the Chinese government says do it, it's done, and
Yeah.
they've got plenty of labor.
If you'd like further information on developing air cargo topics, go to www.aircargonews.com. If you'd like a free subscription to Air Cargo News and to our thrice weekly publication Flying Typers, write to me, Jeffrey, at aircargonews.com. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and keep 'em flying.